So, regardless, please keep the tracking to clarification question if there's some deeper discussion at the end.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for being here. Happy to see so many of you here. So my talk is titled Self-Supervised Costmap Learning for Off-Road Vehicle Traversability. I want to thank the members of my committee for being here, Basti, Deepak, Jonathan, and Gokul. Deepak and Gokul are on Zoom. So I'd like to start this by just showing you a little video of something that happened in one of our data collections last year, March 2022. Now, just for some context, in Pittsburgh, it's very snowy, rainy in March. So I'm going to play this little video. The people on Zoom will not be able to hear the audio probably, but for the people here, I think it's pretty funny. So pay attention to that. This is our vehicle. For context, I am teleoperating it. This is not autonomous.
You can try cutting it and trying to get out of here.
Now, this means that it was very, very muddy that couple of weeks. No. So as you can tell, like it's quite rocky. Andrew really likes it though. And so now we got to this part where I was trying to pick the best line because it looked kind of sketchy. Again, this is not autonomous. This is me driving it. We got mega stuck. The result of that was this. We had to get towed out of that situation. And again, just one more time, this was not autonomous. This was me, and I was not trying to get the vehicle stuck. I just could not discern like muddy parts where we could drive over versus muddy parts that were just like way too deep, way too sticky. All that is to say that off-road driving is quite challenging. Again, like without even being autonomous, but when you put the autonomous part in it, it becomes extra challenging. So this is the overall theme of this talk, off-road autonomous driving. And it's good to motivate why we even care about this. So there's the obvious applications like agriculture. It's always, you have to get to the crops. You have to like navigate around crops if you want the autonomous like farming. There's like humanitarian missions or search and rescue is a classic example. Here's an example of sub-T and environments in a cave. The other one is just like there's no roads in outer space, or in planets, so you just have to go off road. And the thing that's not as obvious is that in reality, there's a study that says that the majority of roads in the world are unpaved. So 65% of roads in the world are unpaved, and 50% of them have like no all-year accessibility, which means like with bad weather, they deteriorate really badly. And I guess perhaps like most important for me is that I've seen a whole fair of those in South America where I'm from. So it's not a strange problem. You just have to know how to pick good lines when you drive. And here in CMU, we've been pretty lucky to have such a big history of this specific problem in different types of like settings and like bigger challenges. And Terrigator was the very first like outdoor autonomous robot that was Red's project. And that already like thought about like how can we navigate off-road autonomously. And there's been a whole history of these with like Groundhog, which was like a mining robot, Highlander in the DARPA Grand Challenge. CMU did very well, but we did even better in the Urban Challenge. And then Sub-T and Racer are the latest examples of that, which having like big challenges or DARPA projects trying to like dive into this topic. So the main question of this thesis and of this problem is, where can you drive? It's a very simple question, but it's not obvious. The answer is not obvious. So if you have this little vehicle, like it can navigate pretty like loose terrain. You can see it drifting, you can put it off-road. I guess this shows that even like small RC cars can just drive off-road if there's no big obstacles. But then you can also have vehicles like this massive crusher tank-like vehicle, which it can pretty much drive everywhere. So the answer is like, it depends both on the environments that your robot is in, but also depends on the actual vehicle. It's not just a thing of this environment is suitable, this environment is not. As you can see here, this robot does not care what you put in front of it. So this is our vehicle. This is our testing environment. It's out here in Gascola, and this is just a video showing some of the challenges that we personally face. So there's puddles, which, as you saw before, if there's a lot of water or a lot of precipitation, it can create mud. We also have overhangs in vegetation, and more like generally, we have things that block our perception, such as dust, snow, different particles that may jump. We also have pretty rugged terrain that you just kind of have to like maybe drive around, but you can't drive over it. It's just not preferable. And then, as you'll see here, we enter the great vegetation, where you have anything from like big trees, like small bushes, little patches of grass on the trails. They're not really trails, and but you can drive over them. And then sometimes there's other things that you just would not expect, like this half car that we found one time driving around. And you also have to know how to navigate like around objects that you probably have never seen before, but you probably want to avoid. On top of this, all these challenges are also presented on different types of slopes. So going uphill, going downhill is not quite obvious either. You can have a PID that tries to adapt for it, but when you have this type of loose terrain, things can like become really nonlinear, really like weird. So there's a couple of desired properties that we have generally when we do off-road autonomy. One of them is that we do want to make sure that if we need to, we can make use of the full extent of navigation capabilities of the robot. So this means if we have that massive like crusher tank vehicle, yeah, just drive over whatever if you need to really get to your goal. Having said that, we do want to navigate safely so we don't damage a robot or we don't end up like with a robot being stuck somewhere like I showed earlier. And lastly, we want to be able to set actual goals for the robot to follow. Like we don't just want to let it roam around. It's important for us to have like a way to control what the robot does, like, for missions and whatnot. So there's two parts to this talk. One of them is I'm gonna go over like this problem definition for off-road autonomy, and then I'm gonna actually present our contribution, which is self-supervised Costmaps. So let's start with this guy. So we're gonna cast off-road navigation as a trajectory optimization problem. So what this means is you have a set of states, and to move from state to state, you can take a set of actions. And there's this optimization problem that you're trying to minimize to reach the goal. So this is like one equation, but the translation in words is that given a model of the world, we're gonna find a sequence of actions that minimize the cost to reach the start goal. So in this case, the blue circle is the goal, and you start at like X1, which is the beginning state. So let's break this down into all their parts. So let's start with the model of the world. In this talk, in this talk, we'll use a kinematic bicycle model or in this work. And even though it's a very simple model, as you'll see in a bit, it's very, very popular. Like probably most state-of-the-art algorithms like for off-road driving like end up using something quite similar. And the reason for this is that it's really, really hard to model all the nonlinearities and all the things that actually pop up when you drive off-road. Like it's really hard to model the environment, but it's also really hard to model how the vehicle actually reacts to that environment. So suspensions, slip, all that. So, and this gets you surprisingly pretty far. So let's start with kind of like describing how it works. You start with some position of the robot. I guess if it's not obvious from this is trying to model a bicycle. So like you pretty much abstract your four-wheel robot into two wheels. So you collapse along this axis, and then you're able to steer with your front wheel, and the back one is like fixed at some angle. So you have some position for this whole vehicle. You have position in X, Y. You also have an orientation for the vehicle. You set a forward velocity, and you're also able to set a steering angle for the front wheel, which actually allows you to turn. And this is all dependent on the actual wheelbase of the robot. So if you have a very long robot or vehicle, you kind of have to do like a wider turn to be able to like get somewhere on the other side. So this first like three things, position in X, Y, and yaw are all your states. Your velocity and steering angle are your actions. And then this wheelbase is a model parameter. There's like more complicated versions of this, so you can like start adapting it to like fit your needs. But this is the basic model of what we actually use. And in case people want to actually see the equation for the model, this describes how the model actually goes from one step to the next. So if you take any action at state xt, this v like term down here tells you what the derivative of that will be. So that's the model of the world. Now I'm gonna talk about the desired, how we actually reach a desired goal. So there's two parts to the goal. We want to figure out, oh, is there someone on? No, we want to figure out where to go and how to actually get there. So there's two terms to this cost function that I'll break up now. So where to go is given by, or in our case, it's very simple. It's given by the distance between the current position and the goal position that you're trying to reach. So it's a triangle, like, distance, just like L2 norm will do the trick. There's cases where this doesn't work as well, and you do have to do a bit of tuning. That's why you have this gain term here. But generally, like, that takes you pretty far. And how to go to the actual goal is given by a Costmap. So big spoiler, this will be our main contribution. So maybe like the part to pay attention to. But a Costmap is simply a spatial representation of your environment where you divide you put the map in like 2D or your environment in 2D, you split that into different cells and you will assign costs to each of the cells. And in this case, I drew a little sketch. The lighter version or the lighter squares are low cost, the darker squares are high cost. And what you generally want to do is follow the areas of the environment with lower cost. So in this case, instead of like directly going like, like Manhattan distance, like all the way to the left, all the way up, you can just follow like the Costmap to get there with lowest cost. The question for us is how do we actually get this Costmap, and we'll look into that in a bit. The important part of this is that in this formulation as a trajectory optimization problem, this goal is actually defined within this cost function. So the cost function encodes both where we want to go and how we want to get there, and it's just a simple linear combination. There's other ways to do it, but for us, this works very well. So that's kind of how we reach a goal and why we actually want to minimize this cost. But how we actually do it is with a model predictive control algorithm. So we use model path predictive integral control, which is called MPPI, and we use a sampling-based version of this. So this is a little sketch of what actually happens. You have a model of the world. So what you can do is you sample K trajectories for T steps. In this case, T is 4, using the known model. So these are all kinematically feasible trajectories. And then you sample a bunch of these, say like you'd end up with these different costs where like bright or like lighter is lower cost, darker is higher cost. What you then do is you do a weighted average over all the trajectories that you have, where the weight is inversely proportional to the cost of that trajectory. So in this case, lowest cost trajectories will have more weight. So the sample or the weighted average will end up like looking more like the trajectories with lower weight. In this case, I didn't want to like draw the averaging, but you effectively like choose the next action from that resultant trajectory of like the average of all trajectories, like the weighted average, and then you repeat. So you are planning at every single step. And there's a couple of really nice properties about doing things in this like MPC type of way, where if you replan at every step, that gives you very quick like I guess adaptability when you like either dropping a new obstacle. Like it makes it very easy to deal with dynamic obstacles and things like that. So just to do another rollout, say we do 3 samples. This top one looks like it's the best, so then we'll take this next action, and then we keep on repeating that until we reach a goal. So that's the optimization or the trajectory optimization formulation for a problem. If there's any quick clarification questions, it's probably a good time to ask them, but if not, yeah. It's using, oh, that's a good question. So normally we use a model, right, for like to sample each one of those. And I guess the answer is, I don't think. I guess I don't know if the average will actually be dynamically feasible based on the math. That's why I'm like a bit hesitant to say like, yeah, it will be dynamically feasible. I think it is, but even if it's not, it gets you close enough that with this MPC formulation, you'll be able to like replan again and like almost like steer towards the actual one that you want. So it does like, I guess a bit of like a. Yeah, we do. No, we average over, that's a good question too. I want to say, Yeah, I think that's how we do it. I think we average over the actions. Yeah, and then the actions are like, you just take the next, yeah, it's an average over the actions. Yeah, that's true. Right, yeah. Right. Because you're just like doing the action on the dynamically or kinematically feasible space, I guess. Yeah. Okay, well, I'll keep going just in the interest of time. So that is the problem definition and I guess the formulation that we use. Now I'll actually dive into our contribution. Just to rehash again, our main question is where can you drive? And this is an example. This is outside in NREC. If I were like a little vehicle in this environment, the places where I would want to drive are not over the barrels, right? Like I would probably want to drive anywhere except for like the big orange barrels. So the simple answer is like, you can probably drive in an occupied space. And this has been done like, for years now. This is how the problem for like off-road or like even like any navigation is usually formulated, where you have occupancy maps as cost maps. What this means is that say you're able to like measure the height of everything in your environment that you can see. If the objects in a specific cell are taller than some threshold that you set, then the cells are occupied. If not, they're unoccupied. So I just drew up a little sketch of like a cost map here where the black regions would be occupied. So therefore that would be a high cost. Everything else is fair game. So you would just drive on those areas. And this actually works surprisingly well in a robot. Something that's like nice about this problem is that it really drills down the point of like, if there's simple solutions, like they take you very far. So in this case, I'll just show like a little video of us driving around our environment. And you can see that with this formulation at different thresholds, you are able to make out like the paths, you're able to make out some of the obstacles. When you have a higher threshold, you are not able to distinguish grass versus no grass. We'll get back to that. But in general, if you have a policy that just follows the empty regions or the unoccupied regions, you can drive on the trails and most of the time not crash. So there's a couple of fundamental flaws with this approach. One of them is that height is not enough to determine traversability. As I showed you before, these two like parts of the trail, both are about the same height. They have wildly different terrain properties. And the only reason why we know that is because we're able to actually perceive, with our experience, that like the left one is very, very muddy, sticky, versus the right one is more like packed. So height is just not enough. You have to actually know something about the terrain properties. And this is enemy number one in off-road driving, tall grass. The other issue is that there are tall compliant objects such as grass that are traversable. This is not the only example, but there are things that you can drive over, and just like having a hard cutout of like, these are the things like usually when you use this formulation, you have to be very conservative with the threshold. You have to set a very like low threshold to stay on like things that are for sure just like paths or like trails or whatever. So there's a couple of really big fundamental flaws, but it does take you like somewhat far. Another different approach now with like the coming of deep learning is that you can do semantic segmentation. So this is a trail somewhere out here in going towards West Virginia. And I like this example because it's very clear where you would want to like drive, walk, whatever, right? You would want to probably stay on the path. So one thing you can do is if you have a camera, you have a segmentation model, passes through a segmentation model, and you can, have this is vegetation, this is a trail, maybe you also have the sky. And a simple policy to try to like navigate safely could be like drive on the trail and avoid vegetation. Sounds pretty reasonable. And it is fairly reasonable. We have work from the Air Lab where we showed, they showed that you can have better navigation with semantic segmentation by doing just this. What you do here is you pass your images through a semantic segmentation model. You label each of these classes with a specific cost. And so if vegetation is higher cost than trails, you'll try to prefer like going over trails and vegetation. And this works okay. Like it actually does, improve navigation. There's, again, fundamental flaws with this approach. And one of them is that semantic segmentation does not scale well with more data. If you go back to this little example, I manually, labeled this. It took me about 3 minutes. And it's not a simple like picture. There's like 3 different like labels: sky, vegetation, trail. And it still took me quite a while. So if you have, thousands of images, if not millions of images that you need to use or to train a model for semantic segmentation, it really becomes an issue where like segmenting, labeling all the images will take a lot of time, cost a lot of money, and you are not able to keep adding data points to your data set without these labels. The other issue is that you may have to have fixed each of these classes limited. So going back to our example, right? If I had like mud here or like this may be a better example. If I have mud and I have trail, both of these are trail, except if I label the whole thing as trail, then you only have a fixed cost for like both of these scenarios. So that's fairly bad. And the last one is that semantic segmentation is not obvious. Like if I were to ask any of you like how to label this particular scenario, I would get like 10 different answers at least. And sometimes it's really hard to segment, what is traversable versus what isn't. And there's also not like a right answer. If you have the crusher vehicle that I showed earlier that can go over anything, the cost of that vehicle traversing over like any of these will be much lower than like the little race car that I showed. So it's not very obvious. And yeah, so there's a couple of fundamental flaws with semantic segmentation. So our goal is to capture this nuance of traversability directly from the data without human labels. So quite a lofty goal. But we did publish a paper about this, and this is what I'm gonna like try to describe now in more detail to show that there is a way to do this. Like there is a light, and we hope to like try to like go more towards these type of approaches in the future. So just to introduce our main contributions, one of them is that we're able to learn a network that predicts self-supervised continuous traversability Costmaps. This is we also demonstrate that we can condition on velocity and that this actually makes a difference in what type of Costmaps you predict. And the last one is that we actually show this on 2 different robot platforms, different environments, different like configurations in terms of like navigation stacks. So there's a very simple insight to this, and it's there's some things in the environment that are very undesirable, and bumpiness is one of them. When you drive over things and you're like shaking around, you don't want that. So just as an example of that, this is Sam Trieste driving me on the vehicle over a very smooth trail. And this was, quite nice. I mean, it was a very, not a lot of vibration. This is him driving me over rough terrain downhill, and I was very scared and very shaky. So it was not very nice. And the way to actually quantify that is that you have proprioception sensors that encode this feedback. So if you look at like just how much like the lines wiggle around the center line, when you drive over smooth trail, there's like not a lot of variation. There's definitely that vibration that you have both from the engine and just from just driving around. But when you actually drive over, rough trails, then you can see that just like shaking around like crazy. So, when we saw it's like, okay, there is a signal that encodes how good or bad it is to drive over different types of terrain. So we use just that. We train a network to predict a continuous traversability Costmap from IMU feedback. This is the summary of our contribution. There's a lot of design decisions that actually make this a cool method that I will try to describe in the future. But the main idea is quite simple. So this is our system overview, but I'll actually dive into each of these parts in a bit more detail. So start with the input. The input to the network is terrain patches and velocity. So to begin with, we need data from somewhere. We used our data set. Now this is a data set collected from AirLab around 2021. And this is like the same vehicle that we test in. I'll say that, just to make it clear, like it is the same vehicle that we test in. It is the same type of environments that we test in. But there's a couple of really cool things about this data set. One of them is that it's multimodal. It has like images, like proprioception sensors such as IMUs, wheel encoders, stuff like that. And it sets it on like, it's about like a couple of hours of data, both aggressive, like very like mild, going up slopes, going downhill, whatnot. once we have this data set, we take a pair of stereo images, and we the nice thing is we have stereo images, so we can get a point cloud out of that, and then we can colorize this point cloud and get top-down maps. So from this colorized point cloud, we can get an RGB map and a height map. Now, one thing that I think is really important to notice is that the resolution of this, at least very close to the vehicle, is quite nice. It's around 2 centimeters. And usually if you use odometry from like SLAM or from like GPS, you're not able to get this type of resolution. So one thing that is an important design decision that we did is that we used a stereo-based or a learning-based odometry, again, from our lab, from Wenshan, called Tarn VO. And effectively, once we start accumulating frames, since this like network gives you really nice odometry, like in one step, like at one time step, you're able to accumulate in really high resolution. So once we have these top-down maps, we have a spatial representation of what the robot actually sees. Now, one design decision that is very like important here is that we operate in the spatial representation. Like this means that it's quite easy to take it from this to a Costmap. But yeah, I guess one thing that we do is, I guess I'll highlight that. We have data of us driving around, and we have the proprioceptive feedback from the IMU. But we cannot like tell you over there, like, you know, this is the current, or this is the measurement that you will take in the future from IMU. So the idea is that we will look at the trajectories that we drove over. We have the accumulated proprioception data from that. And from there, we're able to actually get like mappings of like, this is what I saw when I was here over there, and this is what it felt like over there. So then we're able to, like, given the history of data, do that mapping. And again, like we pass in like both the patches of like where we actually drove over, as well as the velocity at which we drove the vehicle. That will like, I'll show some images of why that actually matters. But now we need a training target. So this is perhaps the trickiest part because there is no ground truth. And the best we can do is like have some score that you hope like will be able to like serve as ground truth. And so we call this like a bumpiness pseudo ground truth. So this section is going to be a bit mathy, but I'm going to try to like decompose it a little bit. So the actual score that we use is the band power of linear acceleration like in the z-axis as our like ground truth cost. So this is somewhat analogous to magnitude of a signal, except it's in the frequency domain. And to make it even simpler, it's like just how much a vehicle vibrates up and down. So it's a score of that. When we actually look at the math, this is a power spectral density, which is the distribution of energy in the frequency domain per unit time. This is, I guess, for the people that know a bit more signal processing, this is nicer than just having like Fourier coefficients because it's not dependent on the length of your signal. So when you usually do like Fourier decompositions and you try to work directly off of that, that will have, or the length of the signal that you actually use will have a huge effect in the actual magnitudes. So this one is per unit time, which means that you're able to get like how much like each frequency plays a role in the signal without taking into account like the length of the signal you're using to do this Fourier decomposition. There are some like little like other nuances, but in interest of time, I won't go into them. But yeah, this is of a specific frequency in the linear acceleration z-axis using a method called Welch's method. We have the bounds of integration. So we have some frequencies that we integrate over to find this cost. And that's how we're able to get this like pseudo ground truth cost. As you saw earlier, like I'm encodes like all this information and just like, if you look at it in the time domain, but we wanted to do something just like a bit more robust to like in frequency domain. So yeah, again, like the summary of this cost is just how much does a vehicle vibrate up and down. And then once we have this like input that we pass through a network to try to predict this like pseudo ground truth, we train the network, and at inference time, it's a bit different. When we drive over or when we use the dataset for training, we only look at specific patches that we drove over, versus when we're trying to actually predict the Costmap in the future, we don't have the information for you know, what the IMU cost will be over there. And we want to sample not just like the trajectory that we drive, but we want to sample an actual full Costmap. And the answer is quite simple. We again just like uniformly sample like the top-down RGB and height maps, and then we have some stride, and we pass like each of those patches through the network. Now, there's also an important design decision here in that being able to sample like uniformly with some stride gives you control of how much computational resources you actually use when you run this on the real robot. So when you run this on when you run things in general in the real robot, you have to be a bit more concerned with how fast things can run. And so what we found is that like changing the sampling stride, as well as how many patches of terrain and velocities we pass as a batch to the network, lets you control both how much memory, like GPU memory you use, and how much RAM you use. And when we were running things out in the real world, these were two parameters that we tuned like according to the capability, like compute capabilities of our robots, to try to decrease the amount of compute that we needed. So going back to the first part, if you remember this slide with a Costmap, which encodes how you actually get there, this is all we really do. You know, we take this Costmap that we predict, we put that into this formulation where now we have like something a bit more continuous, and that's how we predict costs that then are used in this off-road autonomy problem. So in general, we see that our cost maps are more expressive than the baseline. The baseline in this case is the occupancy-based baseline, which is quite simple. We didn't fully compare with a semantic segmentation approach. And the reason for this was that our data set is not labeled at all. So putting the effort to like label everything would have taken a couple of grad students a lot of time or a lot of money in AW or Mechanical Turk. So this is a baseline with like a high threshold for what is occupied versus not occupied. And the reason for this is that we don't want to nerve the capabilities of the robot. Like we don't want to say like you cannot for sure ever drive on grass, but we do want to avoid tall obstacles such as like trees or fences or things like that. And as you can see here, our cost maps are a lot more, they capture a continuous gradient of costs, which is lower on like the smooth dirt, but it's higher on grass and gravel, versus this other baseline is very like, has minimal detail and only really captures large objects. So there's another design decision here, which makes it really nice. And that is that we have this inductive bias of operating in spatial representations. So we try to predict cost maps directly, which are a very interpretable, I guess, representation of space. And usually in navigation stacks, they have cost maps as part of their stack. And the fact that we are able to predict the whole cost map means that if we want to take our method to any navigation stack, we simply add these two together, and we now have added our capabilities onto any navigation stack. So there's just a couple more examples here to like show like what our network is able to predict. So in general, like packed dirt areas have the lowest cost overall. If you look at vegetation, it has a higher predicted cost than smooth paths. This makes sense because usually you're driving over like it is traversable, but it's still like branches and like leaves and like roots and whatnot. And then one nice thing is that we're also able to capture this effect of gravel and larger pebbles on the cost, and these have usually a higher cost than the packed dirt. So coming back to the effect of velocity, our model is able to capture like how velocity actually like higher velocity leads you to higher costs without us explicitly telling it that. So we just gave it the information of like, this is the velocity at which we drove. And if you look at what happens, the model is able to predict that at higher velocities, you end up usually having higher costs. So this is an example of 4 different cost maps at different velocities. And if you look to the right, like the cost of all parts of the environment are generally higher. And you can still make out like trails versus grass in this. Okay, so we wanted to run some sort of like unit test to see, okay, does this actually work? And this is one example of that. Again, the baseline has a very high threshold for occupancy. So in this case, the goal is to drive like 200 meters straight, but there are different types of terrains in the environment. And this baseline is like, it just cannot capture this nuance, right? Even though both are traversable, there's clearly a more preferred path, and it just like gauntlet. It goes straight through, like shortest distance wins. Versus when we actually use our Costmap, we're able to see that, first of all, we're able to notice the grass. Like there is a lower cost on the right on the trail. So it steers towards the grass. And then if you look at gravel on the left side, that flares up, and we end up skirting around. And then generally, so there's a couple of first ways that we continuous cost maps accurately present the effect of. So we're trying to throw away all these semantic labels. And the other thing is that our model learns that generally higher velocity leads to higher traversability costs. So those are two very nice things that we're able to show. But the real question is, does this actually matter? Do our cost maps actually help to improve off-road navigation? So these are all kind of like unit tests and just like outputs of our model. And the answer is that, yeah, we can people hear me or see me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. Sorry about that. I think Wi-Fi did its thing, like bad Wi-Fi. Oh yeah. Perfect. Amazing. Okay. So yeah, again, when we just have the baseline, we're not really able to like differentiate between like things that will end up leading to a bad result. So here, grass usually means you're starting to enter areas with vegetation, which usually have like bigger trees when you go a bit deeper, versus when we have our cost maps and it tries to actually avoid vegetation. What this leads to is to the robot actually taking a wider turn to avoid this vegetation, and thus you end up preventing an intervention. And this is a trend that we see like in most of our courses. So I'll just show this other one in this green course, which has a lot more vegetation, but on flatter terrain. And again, when you see, the baseline, it just kind of like wants to go through the grass because like geometrically that's faster. But when we have our method, it also tries to stay in the more peripheral areas. So it goes and takes a nice wider turn and no intervention, which is great. So the answer to this question is, yeah, we're able to actually improve off-road navigation somewhat significantly. And we can add that to one of our takeaways. So The big question is, what if we actually want to use this on a different robot? So like I mentioned before, this was trained on our similar environment, similar robot. And the answer is we can actually adapt our model with about 1 hour of offline data. So thanks to our great sponsors, we were able to like go test our model on their robot, their testing environments. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to highlight. It is a different robot. It is a different environment, like completely, and it is a different autonomy stack. Like we are not just taking like our thing and like running everything like there. We are like using like parts of their stack and actually integrating into their system. And again, it's made stupid simple by just being able to like add whatever Costmap they have with like our Costmap. So we ran like these unit tests similar to the one I showed before. And here you can see like when we run the baseline, it just wants to again like go straight like the shortest path to like the goal. Versus when we run ours, it actually like follows the smoother path. You see this like jumping around a bit, and that's because we were running too many things on like GPUs, I think. So it started to like the control started to get a little throttled, and we didn't have enough time to like fix that on site. But behaviorally, it is doing what we would expect it to do. We also graphed this other scenario like where we manually trashed the left side of this Y, and we cleared the right side of this Y. The goal here was to see if we have a goal that's like all the way at the end, and we have these two options which nominally are equally good, but one of them is like definitely more trash than the other. Like, will our method actually capture this and like prefer the right path? And the answer is again yes. So here we just ran for 3 rounds with the baseline. It chooses the left path once, chooses it twice. Then luckily it chose the right path the 3rd time. But then when we actually run our model, like it chose the right path every single time. Yeah, again, there's a bunch of this jerking around, and there it also did mess up later on. But behaviorally, to begin with, it did like choose the smoother path. So this is a nice check that our method is able to easily adapt to other robots, other environments, and other navigation stacks. So this concludes kind of like the 2 parts of the presentation. I'm just going to go into some like other little takeaways. But yeah, if you take one thing from this talk, is that in robotics, every single sensor holds valuable complementary information. And it's good to find ways to make use of them all. So usually what ends up happening is people either work on like abstract land where you have for sure a given state, so you don't even have to worry about perception. Sometimes what people do when you actually care about having some perception is you just have like an image classifier or something and you just let it rip. But what we want to like communicate is that there are very important signals in every sensor that we have. We're lucky in robotics that we have a lot of different sensors, point clouds, images, IMU, whatever you want. And we have them couple lean time. So it's good to try to make use of all of this information. There's a couple of things that would make this work even cooler that we've started exploring. So one of them is that, again, we worked off of a human collected data set. And one thing about data sets is that the humans are not going to try to crush the robot, right? Usually these data sets implicitly encode preferences over how to drive. So combining like all the supervision they get from multiple sensors with some sort of inverse reinforcement learning is a very interesting direction to try to couple preferences with how the robot terrain interactions actually happen. The other one is that more data is always great. So finding ways to exploit other sensors for input, such as point clouds or language, are like interesting directions, but you can also use these for supervision. So for example, we have wheel encoders on a robot, and if we wanted to have a similar formulation, not for like bumpiness, but say for slip, one thing you could do is use the wheel encoders as well as your velocity that you have to try to predict like what areas of the terrain will lead to you like slipping around. So this is important when you drive over snow or mud. And the other source of feedback you could have is something like human feedback. And the third very interesting direction is how like investigating just how fast you can actually learn and adapt in new environments, given that we need no human labels. So before, when we use like semantic segmentation, stuff like that, there's usually the bottleneck is in how much supervision you can actually get, how much how fast you can get the data, and like who can collect all those labels. But if you just have a robot and you just need to drive it around to collect data to get your supervision and your inputs, then like this really opens up to actual like continual learning. So these are directions that we started to look into. Like there's some work in this from Sam, Parv, and everyone like who we work with. But yeah, I guess that concludes most of the talk. For me, I will continue to do some of this work, hopefully in the University of Washington as a PhD student. I'm going to be advised by these two great people, Byron and Abhishek. And there's two takeaways that I took over my entire time here. One of them is that robotics is a team effort. This all would have sucked to do it alone. I'm very lucky that I had Wenshan, like Basi. Sam has been a massive like help, as well as like all the other people in the group. And the other one is that success in research is infinitely divisible. So with that, I want to thank all the people that have actually helped me make this work happen. Basti, Wenshan, Sam, Matt, Andrew, Cherie, Mukhtar, Parf, and Chase, and all the people in my committee who have had very interesting discussions with and have motivated me to like, look into these directions, Deepak, Jonathan, and Gokul. I've been very lucky to be part of some communities that have really truly inspired me, like AirLab and FRC. Again, like I showed in that previous plot, like the history of robotics has happened right here in the basement. And it's great. It's great to talk to all these people, and I've been really inspired by all of them. I also want to thank my family, my friends, my previous mentors who have got me here, and all the people that made this time really fun. So yeah, it's been great being part of RI. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll open it up to questions. Yeah, thanks.
Maybe some of these models, but I think it's good maybe to maybe like maybe the first down and second and everything.
Yeah, so I guess if
Maybe
Gokul maybe, or yeah.
Yeah, am I the furthest away?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Sure. So I guess I have like one or two questions. First off, I wanted to say an excellent talk. I learned a lot.
You got it?
So one thing I was sort of interested about was, when you get the data, for actually training this Costmap, right? There's going to be things you never saw someone do just because they're like, very unsafe. You hopefully never see someone like just driving straight into a tree or something like this, right? So how did you account for these sort of situations? Was it like combining it with some sort of baseline cost map, or?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's exactly the answer. Yeah. So again, like these are all some of like I guess like design decisions that like ended up making like a big difference. So in our case, like you said, from our training data, we will never see some scenarios happen. So one of them is like you will never crash into big obstacles, right? Hopefully. So we will never have a way of figuring out like, oh, how does like driving over a wall feel? Because you won't do it. So one way to like accommodate for that is to have like just add with like the baseline, and that's exactly what we did in our tests. One other way to do it is to actually try to like again combine with like the preferences of what you see the humans do in their environment. So some of Sam's work has looked into like encoding all these preferences into like it's a similar representation, a Costmap, and if you add the two, you could get like kind of like also this supervision of like where it's not preferable to drive based on like human preferences more than like on cross-model supervision. But yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? So I guess just to reiterate what you said, you could, by comparing the optimal plan onto your learned cost map and the way a human drove, you could try and figure out what are some other things I should care about. That makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
Maybe one other question. So of course, when first I was really impressed that you could, take this cost map.
Oh, hold on, Gokul, give me
apply it on
one
a
sec. Speaker for Al?
Yeah.
Oh.
No, I think you can't say anything.
Gokul, can you say something?
Hello? Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Can you repeat the question?
okay. Yeah, of course, of course. So yeah, so first I was gonna say, I was really impressed that you could take this this learn cost map and deploy it on a different robot and things kind of work. That was super cool. But a sort of, I guess, a question I have on that note is sort of so of course when you end up in a new situation you haven't seen before, you're probably not going to have very accurate estimates for the cost of traversing things. Like if you've trained on data only from Pittsburgh and you end up going to somewhere with like icy tundra, of course it's not clear what exactly you would do. So have you thought about how you might be able to use something like model uncertainty to deal with kind of things you haven't seen before in the real world?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's exactly. There's two directions like we've been working on like lately, and I guess on my end like just like trying to push before I actually fully leave. But yeah, these are like two directions that we actually like. That's the end goal. One of them is like being able to like model uncertainty so that this kind of adds to like areas that you're concerned about should also have a bit of a higher cost, at least until you see them and you're able to actually like know what happens. And that ties directly to you should be able to learn all of this online. And even if you overfit to your environment, if you have a base model and you overfit to every environment that you see like locally and you're able to overfit really fast, and like then that should be fine, right? Like yeah, the two directions are like, so the things that we've tried is like a model ensemble, and you can see that like when you predict like a bunch of different models all at once, there's areas that like appear like less certain, like in terms of like epistemic uncertainty. And I guess like the question there is like how you actually use that. So one of the answers is like, you can just like add it as an extra layer of costs. I don't know how good that is because it depends on how good your estimator is. But one other thing you can do is you can simply drive at lower velocities until you're more certain of what you're about to drive on. So yeah, kind of like using that to modulate like the velocities, and then hopefully, as you see more of that data, you're able to be more certain about it, which means you can go faster. This kind of imposes already like a curriculum over like learning things that you haven't seen before.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Oh, okay. I think that's all the questions I have. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. I guess Deepak, if you have any questions.
Yeah, so I have a very good talk, Marcus. Just one question. In your bumpiness example, I mean, it's a good proxy measure in some ways, but in some ways it is also like, because bumpiness does not always correlate with with the path, especially in off-road driving, because off-road driving bumpiness is part of it. It's rather
Right.
like in a mud, the car can get stuck or something.
Yeah.
So even though it's less bumpy, and you would want to go over bumpy area oftentimes to avoid
Right.
areas
Yeah.
that are more. Yeah. So what? Yeah. How did you get around that problem, or if you have any thoughts?
So I guess, yeah, the answer is we didn't get around the problem because we didn't encounter it much, but I do have some thoughts on that. So like you said, there's bumping is not always undesirable, and there's other metrics that may be more like desirable. That I guess the answer is you can formulate different metrics in the same way and try to like have different behaviors. So one of them that I've seen do is there's this paper from RSS this year coming out. It's called something like wild navigation, something like that, from ETH. What they do is they have a pretty similar formulation, but for their cost, they have a discrepancy between the commanded velocity and the velocity that you actually observe. So this is another way of trying to encode, I guess, kind of like the capabilities of the robot as part of this cost. And that could get over that, right? If you have like this big vehicle that can drive over anything, and
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
right, you can, that's fine. And again, like you mentioned earlier, the slip example is another version where if you're driving on snow or mud or whatever, and you want to actually like prevent this, you can use other metrics like slip or like predicted like action or the effect of the predicted effect of actions as like, or discrepancy between that as part of supervision. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks. Is
Yeah, a few questions, but maybe I'll just put one or two. I think the main one I was curious about is whether or not after you learn any of these representations, you try to visualize or cluster them. So basically, to what extent are you basically using distance supervision to de facto learn class labels versus like, I don't know,
Interesting,
class
yeah,
labels
yeah.
in the object sense versus class labels in the like roughness sense.
right. So you're saying like if we cluster what we saw, could we get this?
Yeah, for example.
Yeah. So we didn't try that. I think it's not as, I don't think it would work that well.
Okay.
And the reason for that is because there's not an easy way to tell the difference between like difference, like if you just use cost and you're not using your input at all, like you could have like a bunch of logs and you can have like a bunch of like rocks and you can have like some grass, and if all of them like cause a similar effect on the robot, then there's not a direct like one-to-one mapping of like cost to like these specific classes. The other thing I guess is like we are passing velocity as one of our inputs, which means that if you drive at higher velocities, you'll have higher cost overall, which also makes this like one-to-one mapping like non-existent. And the last thing is I just had it and I lost it. But yeah, I guess there's not like a complete one-to-one mapping.
Yeah,
I guess, was that the question?
yeah, but I guess what I'm wondering still is that you are still taking an RGB.
Yes,
And
yeah.
so there's some bottleneck in the model somewhere.
Right.
And so it is going to force all of a certain visual class.
I
to be
see.
predictive of a certain, right? So it may not be that the last layer, maybe it's the penultimate
Right.
layer or something like this. But it's
Yeah. I think that's a reasonable approach. Yeah, I think you could end up seeing like at least similar things, kind of like looking or clustering if you look at the intermediate features. We did not try that. Yeah.
Part of the reason, I guess, is because of a follow-up question, which is related to the generalization issue, which is
Yes.
if I now have something new, like, I don't know, bamboo versus corn or something like this, what pre-training objective would I ideally add to my visual stack in order to allow it to transfer like the sort of cost effects?
So if you had like a classifier already and you wanted to add like a
Yeah, so for example, like, is there something that if I took what you're doing, I like made it even more CD, and so I basically say like I'm gonna now add reconstruction losses on the RGB
Right.
in order to force these class representations. Then do I end up in a situation where my representation space is better for generalization? So then if I have a new class,
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. I think that would be one, just like having like a reconstruction lots of our inputs. I think the one I would push for more, that I think is like kind of like ignored in robotics, is that you know the actions you're trying to take, and you can observe the effect of them by just going one more time step in the future. I think that's a big powerful one. If you can just learn or try to learn a model, like a predictive model of what happens as like either an extra task or something, just to like try to make the representations a bit better. I think both could be good, right? Like, because you ideally want something on the perception space, but you also want to encode like the effect of actions in the world. I think it's not enough to just look at like things of like cameras or things that you look from like about the outside. So yeah, I would, that's something that I've thought about a lot. Just like, how can we add like a model learner, or like some very simple, like what are the effects of my actions in terms of like how much they cause like bumpiness or undesirable effects. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, it's a large conversation to just sort of be curious as to what things are implicitly there versus what things we want.
Right. Yeah.
I can hold off on my more.
Yeah, I just maybe have something similar along the lines of context, right? So when you show the example of getting stuck in the mud, or your question of now in snow or other things, and so there's some kind of context where you want to learn, and on the right side some kind of conditioning.
Right. So yeah.
Add that to your approach.
Yeah, I guess that's something Matt's looking at, but the answer to that is like I'll take it in one direction, and let's see if that leads to something good. But the direction is, say you want to learn this all online. And the way you're gonna try to do this is by like trying to overfit a model. Like you don't care about like being able to like recover previous capabilities beyond what your base model is able to do. So say you have a pre-trained model that does this, like our model, and then you put it on the robot, you try to like fine tune it online forever. And then you're trying to like just like make sure that the trained model works like immediately at that step. So in that case, I feel like being able to like change, say you have a way to detect different contexts about the world. So say you're driving in forests, then you have like these like open big paths, and then you randomly like run into like snow. I think being able to detect, okay, this is something that I've never seen before, therefore it's a new context, and maybe like that could like I need to adapt my weight based on this context that I've never seen before. Like I think being able to distinguish that could actually allow you to recover a bunch of different policies that end up like working in most scenarios. So if that makes sense. So what I'm trying to say is like, if you don't have any context and you're just trying to like fine tune forever, there's a likelihood that if you don't care about like, if you don't have anything else that tells you to remember stuff, then you probably like, say I take it like forest to open areas to snow. At first I'm gonna do well on forest because I'm gonna fine tune on it. Then like when I get to open paths, say like I'm just changing my model to just work well there, and then it'll only work there. And then I take it to snow and then it only works there. I think if you add this extra layer of like predicting kind of like what kind of context I'm in, or if you could like add a new context, or like either as an encoded like latent vector or something as part of your network, similar to like Deepak's RMA, I think that could actually help you like fine tune and not forget. That's all, of course, like just me saying things. It would be really nice to see if it actually works. But I think that that could be a way of like trying to actually remember things without hurting like how fast you can adapt.
Yes. Okay, I'm gonna be nice. So I think that partially answers this question, but I think it takes a, how do I make sure that I have continual learning
Yes.
approach? But it doesn't necessarily answer the question of, I'm putting you in a brand new context. What is it that you are leveraging, like as a human, that's enabling you to generalize to the setting that's not present in the models of the architecture right now?
I think there's two parts. One of them is what I know will end up to safer driving. So what I can control. The other one is what I know about how the environment might actually like feel or do. Right. So like if I see big objects, I probably want to avoid them. Like even if I have never seen them before. If I see like things that look very like uneven, or things that look kind of like maybe there could be hidden things, like if I have tall grass, I don't know if there's like a bunch of rocks, like if someone just like dropped like, you know, a bunch of rocks and it's all rocky actually. So I think in terms of like what you can see, like things like occlusions are things to avoid. Things like that look like uneven are good to avoid. Things that look like actually obstacles, like tall, just like, you know, if I were to like make blobs out of everything, are things to avoid. But then on the behavioral side, I know that slowing down will probably make me not get stuck. Or in some cases, not always, right? There's places where you probably actually want to just like gun it. But if I go slower, I can like probe the environment a bit more. And then like
has to change in the model to incorporate any of that.
So we do take into account velocity, which I guess is nice. I guess what would need to change is being able to actually have some degree of uncertainty, so that you know, like, okay, like this is something that I haven't seen before, like being able to just detect that, which is a hard problem in ML, like in general. But there's some ways, and then being able to like, this is actually what I would love to be able to do, like be able to like learn like from one interaction or like from very few interactions, and make sure that those like have a lot more weight than whatever your pre-trained model has. Like there's two ways you can update your model. One of them is like just like trying to like fine tune and try to like make the weights capture the information, but that's slow, right? You need a lot of data, a lot of like gradient updates. If you could like see the one thing that makes you like, say you like see mud for the very first time, and you already start like noticing like something that's undesirable, then like what I would love to do is like, can you just like say this example is like a core thing I want to pay attention to, and then like try to avoid it or do something like that, because you don't know how it will react. Does that,
To paraphrase, one, you have general heuristics that are not present in what the
Yes.
model learns, but you would like somehow to be encoded. And two, you want on-the-fly adaptation.
yes, but I think adaptation in the more like, can you just like either avoid if there's something undesirable or like just query like some KNN like that, like, okay, like if I've seen this once, can I like react to it once? Yeah, that's something I'm looking to investigate more. Yeah. Does that answer the question?
Thanks, Matteo. Thanks for the talk.
Thank you.
Question you can ask Matteo later. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Thanks everyone. Zoom.